my grandmother was in slavery. I remember when she told me the day that they came through and said that slavery was over. And she said they ran and they just went running from door to door. And it was just like a mass of people, just a crowd, like a mob. And she said, and when all the excitement was over, when they realized that they were free, they had nowhere to go.
I was born in Western Virginia. In Western Virginia, you went to school walking. No matter whether it was 3 miles or 5 miles, you walked to school. And walking wouldn't be so bad, except white people passed you on the way to school in a beautiful new school bus and made fun at you.
There was a small town north of my town called Deepwater, and I was old enough to read, and there was a rusted metal sign, almost like a speed limit sign, outside that town that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun set on you." And I remember asking when I was first grade, second grade, my father, what was that sign? And he used an expletive to describe the people that had, supported that kind of idea.
Freedom, liberation, deliverance from people that were feeling mentally enslaved. The physical parts of slavery had long been dissolved, but the mental slavery was still existent.
You can't imagine what it's like unless you see it. Now, you got to understand what was going on. Danville, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Selma, Alabama, all over the South. People were coming out for a peaceful demonstration. Things we take for granted today. But they had water hoses turned on them. They had dogs. They were locked up. They were beaten. They were stomped. There were riots and window break-ins and all kinds of things. People were trying to break out and they didn't know what to do because of the frustration. So people did all kinds of different things. They robbed, they looted, they rioted, they burned their own neighborhoods. All of it grew out of anger and frustration.
I went to New Orleans. Blacks went to one school, whites went to the other school, and that was a time where blacks had to sit behind the sign that read, "All Negroes sit behind this sign."
We had stopped to get gas and fuel, and there would be bathrooms. And right across the bathroom, it would be colored, and it would be white. And you could only go to the bathroom that had colored.
People in the South are very upset because they couldn't eat at restaurants where they wanted to eat. They couldn't drink at fountains where they wanted to have a drink, or they couldn't ride on buses and trains, so there was quite a bit of unrest at that time.
But even in New York, there was de facto segregation. It was different. If you were black and if you were poor, things were different for you.
I had family members who lived in the South, and I had individuals who were involved in the college campus movements that I knew personally. So I had that kind of linkage with individuals who were experiencing the more blatant realities of being locked out of places and not being able to get into colleges and schools.
But then I went to the University of Delaware, and I went there to be an athlete, and another athlete from the same conference I played in high school, a black athlete from Pittman, New Jersey, was also going to Delaware. And they didn't assign us as roommates. They had us in different rooms, but we figured when we got there, we'd just say, hey, look, we'll live together. When we tried to do that, the dorm director said, well, you can't. He said, come into my office. And we both started to walk in, and he said to John, no, not you, just Mr. Page. He got me in his office, and he put his arm around my shoulder and said, this is a segregated university. They're admitted to academic programs, but they live in rooms with each other. They cannot join fraternities. They are not active in student government. And I said, why is this? And he said, well, it's policy. It's a state university below the Mason-Dixon line. What do you expect? And, I mean, it was like the bag came off my head then. You know, it was just like, wow.
In 1963, I was 8 years old. My parents were very active politically. My father took us often to civil rights marches. All of that was very important to my father, and you know, he wanted us to know that this was something that we should think about in our lives.
It was a time where I think the social justice conscious was raised nationally, and I think that's kind of one of the things that this was all about. I was a student at Lancaster Theological Seminary, and one of our professors, Gabriel Facker, who came there to the seminary, really had a passion for social justice and was kind of inaugurating us in relationship to what was going on in the world and to get involved. And he was the person who kind of motivated me to get to become part of this process.
I think because Dr. King and his very persuasive and very convincing and very humanistic manner had created in people a sort of consciousness.
Everyone was excited. So he told our communities what we needed to do. He says, we need to be nonviolent. We need to go to Washington. We need to come in numbers. We need to be peaceful, and we need to let them know that it's time for a change.
I heard about it at the church, and I called the church and to see if they had room on the bus, and they had one seat.
At that time, we were members of the NAACP in Easton, and the Easton branch ran a bus.
Instead of our usual camping trip, which we did every summer, we were going to drive out from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. But my father was very determined, this was very important. And I remember my mother saying to us, we have to do this for your father. This is very important to him. He wants to see Martin Luther King.
A lot of praying on that bus, a lot of singing on that bus, a lot of reminiscing about how it was. People were telling their stories about how it was when they grew up and, all the oppression that they had. And then all of a sudden the joy of maybe this is going to change now.
The captain of the bus took 20 minutes, a half an hour, to explain to us this is not just another demonstration. This is a peaceful demonstration. We will not tolerate any violence, any threat of violence. We will not tolerate cursing or loud talking. This is a peaceful demonstration.
I borrowed a car from a linebacker, and I drove down there, and I got lost. But at the time, I'd never seen so many buses. And I remember thinking, driving down there, that a lot of these buses didn't look like they were either going to make it to D.C. or make it back home. They were these old buses from the 30s and 40s. They looked like old touring buses. And again, it was brutally hot. And you'd pass these buses and you just wonder what kind of sweltering conditions were in there. And
You just couldn't get away from it, it was just stifling. It was so warm with no air conditioning on the bus. The windows were open and you got a breeze every now and then.
And we left about 3 o'clock in the morning. Got there maybe about 7, 8 o'clock that morning. It looked like a ghost town. Everything was closed. Nothing was open.
You had to remember what your bus number was and where it was parked, because hundreds of people, thousands maybe, of people got left behind because they couldn't find their way off the mall or from the Lincoln Memorial.
People came in pickup trucks. People came in Cadillacs. People came in buses. People came in cars that the doors had to be tied up to keep the door closed. It was just incredible to see people from all stations of life.
In Washington, D.C., mass confusion. I mean, you bring 250,000 people, many of which had never been to Washington before, many of which had never been on a trip before.
Well, we found out, and as soon as we got out of the bus, just seems like thousands of people were there. Everybody filing out of the buses. So my dad, got nervous because I didn't want to lose. I remember my dad said, "Don't lose, don't lose." So I went, looking for, close to him, grabbing him, and I was 16, teenager, but I was afraid, and I had never been away from home on such a retreat, I guess, or an adventure like this. So I got off of the bus, and like I said, I found close to my dad, and then I stayed with him. And then the people, oh my goodness, people from all over.
I do remember looking and saying, how in the world are we going to negotiate this sea of people? This is must be like Moses and his Israelite people trying to go to the Red Sea. You lost them when you never find them. So we kind of linked up and held hands, and we had signs, and we were hoping to be very much a part of this celebration.
Masses of people walking from the bus to Lincoln Memorial. A huge walk, but nobody minded because, old people, young people, boys and girls, and there was singing going on, there was clapping going on. We sang freedom songs back there anyway. What do you want? Freedom. When do you want it? Now.
There was just a variety of all kind of people, but the spirit was a good spirit. There wasn't anybody there looking. It was peaceful. It was quiet. With all of those people, it was orderly. There was no pushing, no shoving. Everybody just there on one accord.
And it was so friendly. It was really friendly. Can you imagine going from 3 o'clock in the morning till all afternoon not eating, and people were offering you food?
People were so friendly, and people shared their lunches, and it was so crowded you would almost step on people.
I stepped on somebody's hand who was lying down on the grass, and I remember that very clearly because the person said, "Oh, that's no problem, and so forth." And I was thinking how kind of peaceful and centered this crowd was, that it wasn't an aggressive crowd looking for trouble or anything like that. It just seemed to be a crowd that was at peace.
And then as we were approaching the monument, seeing people with their feet around that reflecting pool, which to me was always kind of sacred, was interesting to see the heat had driven people to peel off some of their clothing and to try to get comfortable. People were fanning with pieces of newspaper or hats or whatever they could get a hold of. There was a definite search for some comfort during that time.
It was people coming out in what had to be a 100-degree day, marching in one of the most inhospitable environments in the United States, manifesting a concern for a cause.
The leadership was late, so there was nothing to do but bake in the hot sun. It was hot. It was a hot day. But the excitement grew and grew and grew, and people began to meet other people, for the first time. Maybe I met somebody from Detroit who had the same burns about racism as I did.
And the amazement of looking around and seeing people immediately connecting with people. People began to take the whole stranger atmosphere away. And people suddenly became instantly bonded to each other and united around a common purpose.
I'm doing something. I'm doing something worthwhile. I'm doing something that's going to make a difference. I'm part of something that isn't going to be able to be denied.
I remember the wonderful presentations by the preliminary speakers and singers, but the very dramatic and most impressive presentation was that I Have a Dream speech.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
When he came out with black Muslims. They were the security for Martin Luther King. They had these little turbans on, and they were all dressed in, I think, white. And they came out macho, and they stood in front of Martin Luther King, and they were surrounding him. And it was Martin, it was Dr. Abernathy, Jesse, Andrew Young.
When Dr. King got up to speak, there was a big round of applause and an uproar of cheering. But when he started to speak, it was very quiet, very still.
I remember there was a hush on that audience. It was incredible. Thousands and thousands of people, and I think you could almost hear a pin drop.
I remember trying to see and couldn't see the speakers, and I said, gee, I can't even see. And my professor said, Muma, you're not here to see, you're here to be.
"50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later.
The sound of the speech was the same kind of sound. The rhythm was the same as the speeches, as the sermons I listened to in these black churches.
The words are sheer poetry. They're lyrical. They're beautiful. They're engaging. They certainly engage your imagination, engage every aspect of your human feelings.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Almost like it was inspirational. Like, nobody wrote this. I'm saying this because after all, he had lived it for 10 years.
He said, I have a dream, and I was looking, because I couldn't see him. I was so far behind him, but they had the audio system, whatever they had there, was actually, and then when he said that, it was almost like he was going to take off in a song.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
I was sitting on my dad's shoulders, and he gave me his handkerchief because he was hot, and so I kept taking off his hat and wiping his bald head, and then I looked down and I noticed that he was crying.
Well, it was just a thrilling experience. You were at the point where you're almost in tears, and yet you're exhilarated, you're happy.
Go back to Alabama and go back to New York and go back wherever you are and let freedom ring.
Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when it happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. I felt like a chill go through me. It was so moving, and then the crowd gave him a standing ovation after that.
I got the impression that this is not the same man that started the speech. This was a different Martin, and a different occasion, and it inspired, I think, millions.
I think after that march, I think that we were all determined that things were going to get better and that we would come back and we would be determined that we would make things better for our children and for the future generations.
I do know that I was there, and so I feel like somehow it's inside of me, and it's always been important to me.
You knew in your spirit that it was going to change. You knew it because you knew that you were going to change it. You were going to do everything that you could in your power to change it.
That march was a surprise and probably opened some people's eyes to the strength of the feeling, the depth of feeling.
I think it had a great effect on my life. It gave me a very strong sense of pride.
It still lives in me, and still is a part of who I am.
I think it changed my life. It gave me more enthusiasm to encourage my children to be what they could be, to be the best that they could be. And I felt that my children had more of an opportunity as things got better.
I don't doubt for one moment that my affiliation with people like Dr. King, with Adam Clayton Powell Jr., with Malcolm X, I don't doubt for one moment that inspired me to be all that I could be. So yeah, I think it affected me, and certainly affects me now because I realize the essence of what Dr. King stood for.
Like you were part of the world. You know, I felt like I was there, just one little speck, but part of this whole world of people.